Well, we've been considering together this book of Ruth, and for the last 2 Sundays when I've been here, we've been thinking about Boaz and about who he was, and that he represents a picture of our Lord Jesus and what our Lord Jesus is to us. But one of the things that it's possible to do with Ruth is to get so engrossed in the book that we lose sight of the context in which this book happened. And I want us just to remember that this morning. You will recall that in the first verse of the book, it tells us these things happened in the days of the judges. And the last verse of the previous book, which is the book of Judges, tells us something about that era. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. The book of Judges, the time of Judges, and therefore the time of Ruth, was a time of anarchy in the people of Israel. There was a sense of self-determinism among the people. Everyone decided what to do, and they decided on the basis of what was right for them. They decided without reference to other people. They decided without reference to the law of God. And they decided without reference even to God himself. It was very much a relativism. And in a sense, this is something that we have become quite familiar with in our own day and generation. You talk to your friends and neighbours, and many of them will say, well, I'm doing what's right for me. And there is this relativism abroad. Now, this breeds certain dangers. Now, many of our young people have been brought up in this condition, in this situation, with these prevailing thoughts. And this brings with it pressures and temptations to younger people that previous generations didn't know. It wasn't on their horizon. And of course, that eventually will bring problems into the church. So when people who have been brought up in this relativistic age, in this way of thinking, come into the church, they come with this baggage that, well, nobody's going to tell me what to do. And for the new believer, this creates a bit of a challenge. And maybe it's a challenge that we will experience here in the church. And in a way, Ruth is a great example of that. And there are things we can learn from Ruth as she comes in among the people of God that illustrate this problem and how to deal with it. So I want us to think a little bit about Ruth as she joins the people of God. And there is a set of incidents that occurs in this chapter that illustrates this principle. The first thing I want us to notice is wisdom rendered. Wisdom rendered, given, offered. And the wisdom is offered by Boaz to Ruth. The setting is really the words in verses 8 and 9, where Boaz says to Ruth, "Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels, and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Now, Boaz, as we have seen, was a very godly man. But he wasn't so head in the clouds that he wasn't in touch with what was going on around him. As I've said before, theology that has no practical implications is practically useless. And our theology has to instruct what we do. And Boaz is very realistic. He's deeply practical. Now, Boaz is aware that harvest was a happy time. Harvest was hard work, but there was a kind of celebratory atmosphere pervading. It was a celebratory mood. You know, all the effort that they'd gone into in sowing, tilling, whatever it was, preparing the ground and getting the crop to grow, was now reaching its fruition, and they were gathering it in. And Boaz was aware that in this carefree, happy atmosphere, that sometimes sexual desires arise, particularly in young people. They are aroused and can run away with them. And so he said he needs to address this. Now, interestingly, this was mentioned in the law of Moses, this particular scenario. So in Deuteronomy chapter 22, we read these words, verse 25. If a man find a betrothed damsel in the field, and the man force her and lie with her, then the man only that lay with her shall die. And then there's some other scenarios that are listed. But the context is about this kind of harvest scenario, and a man finds a woman and rapes her. Now, Boaz is aware that Ruth is tremendously vulnerable. She's a young woman. She's a foreigner. She could easily have been taken advantage of. And she could have been the focus for unwanted advances or worse. And in his wisdom, he gives her some advice. What does he say to her? Firstly, don't go to another field. Don't go anywhere else. You stick here. It may be that he knew that his neighbours, neighbouring landowners, they didn't have the same standards as him. Remember, this was the time of the judges. Maybe he was aware that neighbouring landowners didn't exert the same amount of control over the reapers as he exerted in his field. But clearly the implications are he felt she may not be safe in another field. So he says, you stay here. This is a safe place to be. Next, what he tells her, he says, you stay by my young maidens, my young women, my young girls. You stick with them. Now notice, he speaks of them in the plural, and he's saying that in the crowd, there is a bit of safety. You stay with them. And then he repeats it again in verse 9. He says, let your eyes be on the fields that they reap and go after them. You stick with them. He's repeating it. But then he says, I've also instructed my young men, the reapers that are in this field, they are not to touch you. Now, he's really acting in a way to defend her. He is protecting her from the dangers that he fears that she may be in. Now, I think this is important. It's important that we learn to act wisely in this area. Now, this is not the way the world thinks. This is not the way the world operates. I mean, you want to see the way the world operates? Go down to Mary Street in Cardiff on a Friday night or a Saturday night. You'll see the way the world operates. You don't need to do that. You come to the university on any day of the week when there's a lecture, and you'll see young women dressed to make a kill in lectures. This is the way the world thinks. But that's not what Boaz is counselling. He's counselling wisdom. Now notice, the Apostle Paul speaks about this type of scenario, this type of concept, in his letter to the young pastor Timothy. He says, flee also youthful lusts. Run from them. Put as much distance between yourself and the temptation as possible. And the sad thing is that very often in the church we can kind of think, well, as long as I don't sin, it's all right. I can get as close to the edge as possible as long as I don't fall over. But that's not the counsel of the Bible. It's not the counsel of wisdom. And you can see it in the life of Joseph. Here is a young man, very attractive, very beautiful, very handsome young man who is enslaved. He can't run away. And his master's wife takes a bit of a shine to him. And in the end, he spends no time in the house at all alone with her. He will not be anywhere near her. And when finally she tries to get hold of him, he legs it. He flees. Now, Boaz is counseling Ruth to stay safe in this aspect, in this area. Now, what's Ruth's response to this? Well, we've seen wisdom rendered. We now need to see wisdom rejected. Whether Ruth is disappointed by Boaz's approach is unclear, but if you listen carefully to her words, they seem somewhat disingenuous. Because later in the day, when she goes back home with this massive sack of grain, she dumps it down on the table, and Naomi is over the moon with this huge haul. Ruth recounts to Naomi the conversation that she's had with Boaz. Now, it's very interesting to note what verse 21 says about Ruth. Ruth the Moabitess said. Why does the writer put that? The answer is that what's about to come out of her mouth is Moabitish thinking. This is the thinking of the world. What does she say? He said, stick close to my young men. Really? Is that what he said? He said, stick close to my young women. Now, the difference is very slight. In English, it's a w. In Hebrew, it's an because the Hebrew word for women is nara, and the Hebrew word for young men is na. It's just an There's not much difference, is there? There is a huge difference. Huge difference. And Ruth is saying, I need to stick to as young men. Now that was not only untrue in terms of what Boaz has said, it was a folly. It was a madness. Now notice, she says, he said. It's not just that she was twisting his words, which she was, but she was making him the origin of this folly. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes we're like that. We can be very twisting and deceitful about what people have told us, especially if it kind of cuts across what we want to do. And it reveals the inner workings of our hearts. Now, just put yourself in Ruth's position. Here she is. She's a young woman. She's probably in her 20s. She's already been married once when her husband died. And the grief and the sorrow of that are slowly passing. And she wants companionship. She wants love. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with her seeking the security and the fulfillment of having a husband. Paul makes that very clear in his first letter to Timothy, where he's arguing about how women should be, especially widows, should be treated in the church. And he says, I will therefore that the younger women, and in the context is the widows, marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. He said, look, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not only permissible, it's actually desirable. Marriage is honourable in all, even in the bereaved. But the problem is the way of going about it, the way of finding a husband. And Ruth is reverting to her former way of thinking. Ruth is reverting to the way of doing things in Moab, to the way of the world. And the world says to young women, flaunt your body, flirt. And when that thinking and that behaviour comes into the church, which sometimes it does, there's going to be a problem. Now, the Apostle Peter says that there is something better. There is a much better way. He says about women, he says, likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may, without the word, be won by the conversation or the lives of their wives. While they behold your chaste conversation, not flirting, chaste conversation, lives, coupled with fear, whose adorning, let it not be that seductive outward adorning of gold and pearls and costly array and plaiting the hair and fancy clothes, but the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. And Peter is saying, it's not the outward. Don't make much of the outward, but do make much of the inward. Work hard on the inward to make yourself attractive inwardly. That's God's way. It's not the world's way. It's God's way. So we've seen wisdom rendered, wisdom rejected, but now we need to see wisdom repeated. You see, put yourself now in Naomi's shoes. We put ourselves in Boaz's shoes. We put ourselves in Ruth's shoes. Now put yourself in Naomi's shoes. She's ecstatic. This massive sack of corn is dumped down on the table. Whoa. And she can't get over it. God has blessed us. Boaz. Oh, yes. Oh, now, Boaz. Now I know what God's up to. I've got some idea now. But then Ruth comes out with this pearl of folly. And the alarm bells ring in her head. And she doesn't think twice. She knows she cannot let this madness go. Now, Ruth, she's never going to understand at this point the significance of Boaz as the Redeemer. She doesn't get that. But if Ruth follows this seeming advice, then any hope that Boaz could do this redemptive work will be lost. If Ruth finds another man, or some other man finds Ruth, then the whole thing is lost. And many a Christian's witness is ruined or spoilt by lack of wisdom in this area of relationships. Now the question is, if you were in Naomi's shoes, what would you do if you were faced with this pearl of folly? Well, what did Naomi do? Firstly, she reiterated the wisdom. There it is in verse 22. Naomi said unto Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that thou go out with his maidens." That's it. You go with his girls. But then she goes a little bit further. She's a bit more blunt than Boaz. Maybe she's even a little less delicate than Boaz. Maybe she feels she can say things that maybe as a man Boaz couldn't have said. What does she say? That they meet thee not in any other field. Now the English doesn't really kind of convey the meaning of this. Something of it is seen in the margin. That they don't fall upon thee in any other field. Because this meeting contains within it hostile intent. She is saying to her, don't go anywhere else where somebody might assault you or rape you. She's quite blunt about it. Now, in a way, this is quite a stern message. But notice the setting in which she puts it. She says, my daughter. She's very gentle about it, but she does convey the message. She's also very positive about it. She says, it's good, my daughter, that you do this. She's not thoroughly negative. Now listen, maybe you're an older Christian. Do you know you have real responsibilities in the church? You have real responsibilities to teach younger Christians. That's exactly the point that Paul makes when he writes to Titus. He says, you've got to speak things which become sound doctrine, that aged men be sober, grave, temperate, sound in faith, in charity and in patience. And aged women likewise, that they be in behaviour as becomes holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, here it is, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed. Listen, as an older Christian, you have a wealth of experience under your belt that's been built up over many years, maybe of following the Lord, And you can bring that wisdom to bear on a younger person who does not have your experience and your wealth of experience. You know, when people come into the church from our chaotic world, they will come bringing the baggage of that chaotic world. Most people out there, they don't even know that Mary is Jesus' mother. What hope have they got of knowing anything about how to live and order their relationships? They don't. You look out there, their relationships are like spaghetti. And it's going to fall on us when such folk come among us to help them. And that's going to be difficult. Much wisdom is going to be required. They may come, they may have been converted, and they come in with much enthusiasm. And we have to find a way of helping them without crushing this enthusiasm, but being firm in preventing the folly and the pitfalls that we can see from our long experience on the road. Now listen, this is difficult. But James says, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally and upbraids not. God isn't going to say, well, you ought to know that. No, God's going to give you the wisdom that you need. Listen, my friends, we have to keep following the path of wisdom. So, there we are. Wisdom is repeated by Naomi. Now we need to see, lastly, wisdom received. Wisdom received. You see, now put yourself back in Ruth's shoes. Maybe that was her reason for going to the field in the first place, that she wanted to find a man. It does actually say at the beginning, verse 2, Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the field. Maybe that was her thinking. And it would have been very easy for Ruth to have been resentful and to argue, well, that's not the way we did it in my country. You old fuddy-duddies, you don't understand the younger generation. You don't care if I'm going to be left on the shelf. But she doesn't respond like that. And there is an effectiveness that comes to Ruth through this united message, the message that came from Boaz and came completely independently from Naomi. Listen, my friends, take courage. Sing from the same hymn sheet. Sing from God's hymn sheet. You might be faced with a scenario and you think, oh, this is going to be difficult. I've got to say something. Yes, say it. Say it graciously. And who knows who has already said it before you? And the two messages may be very effective. They were with Ruth. What happened to Ruth? Verse 23, so she kept fast by the maidens of Boaz. She obeyed. She did what she was urged to do. Even if she didn't understand the reasoning for it, she did it. And then it says, she dwelt with Naomi. She dwelt with her mother-in-law. She wasn't out every night partying, trying to get a man. She dwelt with her mother-in-law. And she persisted in this until the end of wheat harvest, it says. Through the barley harvest and then into and through the wheat harvest. Probably a period of about 3 months. And young people can be wonderfully headstrong. They think they know what's best. And the old people have no idea what's best for them. Young people often fail to appreciate the wealth of experience that older people, who were young people once, have got under their belt. And actually, older people do have something to offer. Tell me, are you willing to take advice? Because many people are not. Are you willing to take advice? Take advice from older, spiritually wise people. Ruth did. She did. And it was noted. Now, let's see how it was noted. In verse 2 of chapter 3, Naomi's giving Ruth some instructions. And now is not Boaz of our kindred, with whose maidens thou wast? You were with his girls. And I noted that. But it wasn't just that Naomi noted. It was that Boaz noted. If you look in verse 11, the end of verse 11, Boaz is speaking to Ruth. All the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman. Hold on a minute. It's not just that Boaz has noted. The whole of Bethlehem has noted. And what have they noted? This hidden virtue in the heart. You're a virtuous woman. Not a flaunting, flirty woman. A virtuous woman. Listen, don't be afraid to stand out from the crowd and be different. Don't be afraid not to follow the ways of the world. And if you follow the ways of the Lord and of wisdom, it will be obvious and it will be noted. I would urge you to abandon the thinking of the world. Follow Jesus in all simplicity. And who knows what God has in store for you? Because what God had in store for Ruth would have blown her mind away if she thought about it at this moment. But it was much bigger than she'd ever thought possible. So that, I don't know how many thousands of years later, we're still talking about her. Listen, my friends, put God first. Follow his wisdom. And God will work things out for you.